reason. You think you're gonna fall, you better fall on your face. Your hands go back in the small of your back are down. We are going to you. Do you understand me?
Yes, sir.
Crawl towards me. Crawl towards me!
On January 18, 2016, a man by the name of Daniel Shaver would be out of town from his home in Texas for business, staying at the LaQuinta in Mesa, Arizona. Daniel would later that evening come across these two people at the hotel that he would eventually bring back to the room with him to have drinks and to hang out. Unfortunately, though, the hangout wouldn't last long, as things were about to get really bad for Daniel. Apparently, one of the people Daniel was hanging out with saw a gun case in the corner of the hotel room and asked Daniel if they could see what was inside. So, Daniel would oblige, and he opened the gun case, revealing a pellet gun that he would use for work. Daniel would go on to remove the pellet gun from the gun case, waving it up and down in front of the window of his hotel room, unknowingly showing off his gun to random pedestrians who could see into his hotel room. This would unfortunately set off a tragic scene of events to follow. When Daniel waved his gun around, he also stuck his gun out the window completely, and to the random pedestrians outside who witnessed Daniel with his pellet gun, didn't believe it was a pellet gun, and assumed it was a real firearm, which ultimately led them to calling the police on Daniel.
911 emergency.
Hi, I'm with the LaQuinta and a couple of the guests have come to me. I'm an employee here. They come to me and they told me that somebody's pointing a rifle outside of one of the windows in our building.
The police would respond to this phone call by sending 6 police officers to the hotel looking for what they were told was an armed man. But what they were greeted with was completely different than what any of them were expecting.
Stop! Stop! Get on the ground, both of you! Lay down on the ground! Lay down on the ground!
Who else is in the room?
Nobody.
Nobody else is in the room?
Nobody.
Are you positive?
Nobody. I'm absolutely positive.
Okay. Since apparently we have a failure for you to comprehend simple instructions, I'm going to go over some of them again, okay? Can you both hear and understand me?
Yes.
All right. If you make a mistake, another mistake, there's a very severe possibility you're both going to get shot. Do you understand that?
Yes.
I do.
Yes.
All right.
What the?
This is, shut up. I'm not here to be tactful or diplomatic with you. You listen, you obey. For one thing, did I tell you to move, young man? Did I tell you to
No, sir. No,
put
sir.
both
No,
your
sir.
hands,
No, sir. No, sir.
put both your hands on the top of your head and interlace your fingers. Take your feet and cross your left foot over your right foot. Who else is in the room?
Nobody.
You are to put both of your hands palms down straight out in front of you. Push yourself up to a kneeling position. I said keep your legs crossed!
I'm sorry.
I didn't say this in conversation. Hands in the air! Hands up in the air! You do that again, we're you. Do you understand?
Please do not me.
Then listen to my instructions.
I'm trying to just do what you
Don't talk! Listen, you think you're gonna fall, you better fall on your face. Your hands go back in the small of your back or down. We are going to you. Do you understand me?
Yes, sir.
Crawl towards me. Crawl towards me!
Yes, sir.
Sadly, Daniel Shaver would be shot around 5 times, dying almost instantly. Daniel was unfortunately very intoxicated at the time, while having to face around 6 police officers threatening to shoot him if he couldn't follow the directions properly. And unfortunately, in this case, Daniel was just too intoxicated to properly follow the instructions and would ultimately pay the price with his life. The court would come to the conclusion that Daniel was very intoxicated in this incident and didn't have enough awareness of the situation. Daniel would crawl closer to the cops, just as they demanded. Sadly though, this is where Daniel would make a fatal error. Daniel's shorts would begin to fall as he crawled towards the cops, which caused him to reach towards his back leg to pick his shorts up from falling. This would ultimately cause the police to fire on Daniel, as they apparently assumed he was reaching for a weapon. The officer who would fire on Daniel was Officer Philip Brailsford. The officer would go on to claim that he 100% believed Daniel was reaching for a weapon.
Absolutely 100% believe he was reaching for a gun. I would not have fired my weapon at all.
After investigations, it would later be proven that Daniel actually had no firearms on him, but actually had 2 pellet guns in his hotel room. Not long after the investigations, Brailsford would be let go by the Mesa Police Department and would also be charged with second-degree murder and reckless manslaughter. But it wouldn't take long for these charges to be dropped, and soon after that, Brailsford would later be proven innocent in the death of Daniel Shaver.
We, the jury, duly impaneled and sworn in the above entitled action and upon our oaths, do find the defendant, Philip Mitchell Brailsford, on the charge of count 1, second-degree murder, not guilty.
After being proven innocent, Brailsford would challenge the court, claiming he gained PTSD from this situation. This would help him negotiate a deal to be rehired by the Mesa Police Department. But this was only temporarily, because apparently the Mesa Police Department would allow for Brailsford to retire early and to receive a lifelong disability pension for the PTSD he apparently gained from this incident.
He had PTSD claim prior to his termination, so in fairness, he was given the opportunity to make that appeal to the board. So whatever the mechanism took place, but prior to his termination, his claim was that he had he was suffering from PTSD.
Sadly, Daniel would leave behind a grieving family, including his wife and his 2 children. It wouldn't be long after Daniel passed that his wife and parents would go on to sue the city. They would get a settlement of $8 million for the passing of Daniel. Even though it was a large settlement, nothing can take back the tragic events of what happened that day, as an innocent man was taken from his family way too soon. In 1996, the Seattle Times would go on to publish an article titled, "China Rocket Crashes to Earth, Fatalities Reported in Space, Program Setback." The article would go on to read about the rocket that exploded, stating, "The newly developed Long March 3B rocket, carrying the Intelsat Inc. satellite, veered toward the ground and exploded moments after liftoff at 3:01 a.m. They would also go on to state that the Hong Kong radio said 4 people were killed and dozens injured in the explosion. But Zhang Lihui, a spokeswoman for the government aerospace agency, said there were no deaths. Even though sources were stating there were 0 people that passed away in the accident, Chinese investigators would look deeper into the tragic accident and would ultimately find 6 bodies all together around the crash site. This indicated early news sources had it all wrong, and unfortunately 6 people would pass away following the satellite's crash. Not only would 6 people pass away, there would be another 57 people who would suffer serious to minor injuries following the crash. If it wasn't for this video being uploaded to YouTube by YouTuber Fred V, we most likely wouldn't have any footage of this tragic accident ever happening in the location it occurred. The satellite would be launched in China in 1996. This is where a couple of Americans came to see the launch of this satellite, and this would be the sad and tragic footage they caught. Unfortunately, the satellite would crash into a small little village in China, said to be home to more than over 1,000 residents. Many would go on to speculate how only 6 people passed away from the accident, taken it happened in a very populated village. Things would only get more suspicious as the video continues, as it shows us the aftermath and destruction the crash caused to this village. It's pretty indescribable how much destruction was caused to this poor village following the crash. There would be buildings everywhere just completely destroyed and left in ruins. What makes it even more weird was the fact that destruction and damages didn't occur in just one small area of the village, but actually the damage would be spread out amongst the whole village completely, leaving many to wonder how only 6 people passed away in this accident when the whole village was completely destroyed. It makes you start to wonder how an entire village can be completely destroyed, and only how a few people passed away from all this destruction, when there was said to be close to over 1,000 people living in this village. This begged the question a lot of other journalists had since this tragedy took place. Did the Chinese government cover up the actual number of casualties? And if so, why? Some had the theory they covered up the true amount of casualties because they wanted to defend their space program's credibility. Some speculate this theory because most of the journalists that were there that day were quickly escorted off the site, and the most they saw that day were dozens of ambulances and flatbed trucks that some assume were to load the perished bodies in the accident. But despite the video and all the questions everyone was asking, there has never been an official change to the amount of people that passed away that day by the Chinese government. But this wouldn't stop experts in the United States from giving their own estimate to how many people actually passed away that day. These experts would go on to speculate around 200 to 500 people from this village had perished following the accident. There would go on to be other experts who projected the amount of people who perished that day was even higher than that, and after witnessing the video of the accident and the aftermath left behind, it's more than likely these American experts probably had a better estimate on the amount of people who passed away that day than the Chinese government had originally stated. Sadly, we'll never know the full story and how many people actually lost their lives that day, as the Chinese government has stood firm on their original claims, even stating they had evacuated the area before the launch ever took place. This claim by the Chinese government continues to be questioned to this very day. It's really crazy how what once was a village of over 1,000 people could become unrecognizable just overnight, turning into a complete ghost of itself as it bears destruction and ruins of what was once a little village in the middle of China.
Okay. I don't think I got all of this.
You got a light flashing on that.
I don't know.
In the year 1990, around the month of December, Vaughn Taylor and Edward Deley would be released from prison after serving their terms, Vaughn for aggravated burglary and Edward for arson. The two men would immediately plan a trip up into the mountains of Oakley, Utah, where they planned on shooting people, as Vaughn Taylor quoted in his own words when he called a friend almost immediately upon his release from prison. The two men would set off into the mountains of Oakley, Utah, sometime around December, trying to take advantage of the lack of people staying at their cabins during the harsh winter, as they would use this to their advantage, going around invading these cabins, stealing, and even camping out in them. Sadly, there would be a family that was actually home in one of these cabins during one of Vaughn's and Edward's home invasions. The Tata family, consisting of the grandmother, Beth Potts, her daughter Kay, Kay's husband, Roth, and their two daughters, Lena and Trish, would unfortunately have their cabin invaded by Vaughn and Edward on December 22nd, while they were all out doing late-minute Christmas shopping in nearby Salt Lake City. While they were gone, Vaughn and Edward would just so happen to be in that area of the mountain that the family was staying at, and would end up breaking into the family's cabin while they were still out shopping. After the two men broke into the cabin, it wouldn't take them long to realize that someone had just recently been in the cabin, due to there being Christmas gifts under the tree. This unfortunately gave Vaughn and Edward the perfect opportunity to carry out their original disturbing plan of traveling up to the mountains to shoot and kill someone. So the two men would ultimately decide they would wait at the cabin until someone would arrive. While Vaughn and Edward were waiting for someone to get home, they would end up opening the gifts that were under the tree and recorded themselves doing so. And that's how we ended up with this disturbing footage of Vaughn and Edward opening the family's Christmas gifts just before they would arrive back home. What would go on to make this video even more disturbing was you can clearly see on the side of Vaughn the pistol he would go on to use in the shooting of the family that very day. Things would go on to get even more disturbing that day, because not even a couple of hours would pass after Vaughn and Edward broke inside the cabin. The family would eventually arrive back to their cabin, but to the sight of two men standing inside their cabin. The two men would immediately pull their guns on the family and threatening their lives. Sadly and disturbingly, the two men would grope up, the grandmother Beth and the mother Kay, right in front of her daughter Lainey, just after Lainey prayed to God to protect her family, as Vaughn would respond, saying your God won't protect you and that he worshiped the devil, just before shooting her mother Kay and her grandmother Beth right in front of her. Lainey, being the only one left alive from her mother and grandmother, knew that her dad and sister would almost be home from shopping and tried to convince the two men to leave, but nothing worked, and unfortunately, the father and daughter would arrive to the cabin with the two men already pointing their guns at them. They would go on to threaten the father, telling him to take off all his clothes and give them all his money. The father would oblige, hoping they would just take his belongings and leave, but unfortunately, that wasn't the case. Vaughn would go on to shoot the father right in the face, knocking him down to the ground, and then delivering one final blow to the back of his head. This would only leave the two daughters alive, as they were forced to watch the two men, Vaughn and Edward, cover their entire family and cabin in gasoline and set everything on fire. After they set the cabin on fire, the two men would steal both the snowmobiles the family had arrived on, forcing the two daughters, who were still alive, to get on the back of the snowmobiles with them. As they would drive down the mountain, someone would notice them leaving and would try to flag them down by waving and yelling. This would be the two girls' uncle, Randy Zorn. As Randy would try to get their attention, the two girls would ignore their uncle because of the predicament they were in and wanted to keep their uncle safe by not acknowledging him. Randy would sense something was off and would head down the mountain too, following his two nieces and the men who kidnapped them. This is where Randy would catch the two men and his two nieces getting into the family's car. Randy again would wave at them and even yelling at them, but the two girls would continue to act like they didn't know him in order to protect their uncle. Randy would go on to be super concerned, as he would assume something was off, and that would be quickly confirmed when he would witness their father Roth, despite being shot twice, once in the face and once in the back of the head, and also being set on fire, would somehow survive and cruise down the mountain in a snowmobile looking for help. This is where he would tell Randy that his 2 daughters were kidnapped, along with his wife and mother-in-law being shot. This would go on to save the 2 girls' life, because as soon as Roth told Randy he would call the police immediately, it wouldn't take long for the cops to track down the vehicle they were driving, and the 2 kidnappers would ultimately flip the car, crashing onto the side of the road once they were caught. Luckily, the 2 girls weren't injured, and neither were the 2 kidnappers. But this wouldn't stop Vaughn and Edward from putting up a fight with the cops, putting up a shootout that wouldn't last very long, ultimately giving up and getting arrested by the police. Finally, these 2 guys' terror would come to an end. After some time had passed, the courts would come up with a verdict for the 2 men, Edward getting life without parole, and Vaughn receiving the harshest penalty of them all, the court's conclusion to sentence Vaughn to death for the murders of Beth and her daughter Kay. Both men would seem to be almost pale and pretty shaken when they seen Roth staring at them when they entered the courtroom, as if they were being stared at by God himself. Somehow, Roth would go on to make a complete recovery, which is beyond remarkable, given he was shot in the face, then in the back of his head, and not to mention being set on fire. Roth's story is a remarkable one, and a true testament that good can triumph over evil, given any circumstance. Unfortunately, though, there is evil that exists, and there is no doubt Edward and Vaughn were perfect examples of what evil really is.